so he sought out those five mendicants, and he taught them the first teaching that we recognize is called the Discourse on Turning the Wheel of the Dharma. And it's also known as the Dhammacakka Pavatana Sutta. It is also in the Buddha Dharma, the Path to Enlightenment. But so he teaches them about the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Noble Path. I'm getting some feedback there. I'm just going to mute you all, if you don't mind. Seem to be getting some kind of feedback. Okay, so he teaches them, and they become disciples of the Buddha. And soon after he gives this teaching, so the five mendicants, their names are Kondana and Vapa and Badiya and Mahanama and Asaji. And they become the first five disciples of Buddha. But soon after he teaches them, he then goes on and he tells them, he says, he addresses the mendicants or disciples by saying, disciples, I have freed myself from all shackles. You have also freed yourself from all shackles. Disciples, have compassion for the world, for its welfare and happiness. Roam throughout this world. Two men, however, should not travel the same route. Disseminate the teaching that is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. And the teaching that is endowed with both letter and meaning. Explain the practice that is utterly pure and perfect. In the world, there are people whose eyes of wisdom are only slightly stained. If they do not listen to the teaching, however, they will be ruined. If they listen to the teaching, they will attain enlightenment. So basically, what he did was after his first teaching, he actually told them to go and spread the teachings. Okay, so that was part of the Buddhist understanding, was to share the teachings out of the compassion for the world, to share it with others. So then what happens is after when the Buddha passes away, there's a series of events that happen. First of all, after he passed away, 500 of the greatest monks gathered to what they call the first Sangha Council, first gathering. And this is at a place called Rajagriha. And at that time, Ananda, the closest, the Buddha's cousin and his sort of attendant, he rehearses, he reads out or says, gives what we call the sutra, Dhamma, the words of the Buddha. And another of the 10 great disciples, Upali, gives what we call the Vinaya rules. Okay, so this is immediately after the Buddha passed away. They start gathering, and they have 500 of them that gather, and they start talking, deliberating, saying, these were the words of the Buddha, and here are the rules set forth for the Sangha. And they all agree that those were, in fact, the words of the Buddha. And so then, for about the first 100 years, this period is known as early Buddhism period. And after about 100 years has passed, we have what we call the second of these Sangha gatherings at a place called Vaishali. And this is why I'm sorry, I had all these maps and to show you where this was going on. I don't know where, I'll have to really look for it. Anyways, they have their second Sangha Council. And at this time, there's a division that begins to form. And there's two main groups. One is called the Staviravada, and the other is called the Mahasangika. And the Staviravada group is the forerunner to what we call the Theravada Buddhism. Okay, so it's the way of the elders. They try to be a little bit more orthodox, if you will. And the Mahasangika tend to be a little bit more liberal in their understandings. And so the reason why the division occurs is that the Staviravada claimed that the Mahasangika were too lax. And conversely, the Mahasangika claimed that the Staviravada are too focused on the precepts, the Vinaya rules. And they believe that they even included more rules than existed during the time of the Buddha. So there's this schism that forms between the two of them. But interestingly enough, for about the first 200 years of Buddhist history, after the Buddha passed away, Buddhism is relatively a local religion. And it's situated in northeastern part of India, what is presently known as Bihar or Uttar Pradesh provinces. And it doesn't really expand or grow too immensely. Are you hearing me okay, or is there keep on getting this feedback? Or anyways, okay, so Buddhism doesn't really change or expand, grow that greatly until about 300 years after the Buddha passed away, 200-300 years after the Buddha passed away, with the introduction of the King Ashoka. Have you heard of King Ashoka? Who has heard of King Ashoka? Okay. Does anybody know anything about King Ashoka? Okay. So King Ashoka was actually the third of what we call the Mauryan Empire. Okay. He was the third king in this lineage. And the Mauryan Empire was actually a great empire that at the height of their growth, I guess, it expanded all the way to Greek and covered the Indian subcontinent, basically. And it went all the way out towards, I guess that would be Myanmar today. So it was a huge area, largest empire in that time period. And he was the third king. And it's Ashoka who is widely credited for really spreading Buddhism. Okay. Now, he is known as one of the greatest what do you say? One of the greatest individuals of the follower, as a follower of the Buddha, but he didn't start out that way. In fact, Ashoka was actually what they call a despot, a ruthless individual. Okay? So there are many stories and legends about Ashoka, and majority of them actually come out in Buddhist texts. In fact, for a long period of time, Ashoka was actually forgotten about in Indian history. And it was only after some geological finds that they found out about this King Ashoka. And then they started finding all these more lore than anything else, legends in these Buddhist texts. And it starts off by describing this really, really evil person. And to give you some examples of how bad he was, when his father passed away, King Bindusara was his name. Ashoka is actually not the eldest son, but he was like the second or third son to King Bindusara. And his older brother, who should have rightly been the ruler of the kingdom, Ashoka actually tricks his older brother into going into this pit of burning coal, and he burns his older brother to death. Okay, this is how it's described, right? And he's also another example that happened is that it was said that he burned 500 of his consorts, his female attendants, because he overheard one of them complaining. Ashoka had a skin condition, so his skin was very rough and sort of warty, and he overheard one of the maidens complaining that she didn't like caressing his rough skin. And just because he overheard that, it said that he kills or he burns 500 of them. So very, very ruthless individual. He starts off this way. And when he's in his 40s, he leads his army or sends his army to the neighboring kingdom called Kalinga Kingdom. And Kalinga Kingdom was on the western coast of India. So probably where, I think where Delhi and that area might be. But he goes and invades that kingdom. And there's records of the fact that they slaughter 100,000 inhabitants there, and also send to exile 150,000 more individuals are sent out to exile. But what happens is that after they are triumphant in their invasion, it's said that King Ashoka goes to the battlefield and he sees the carnage and the destruction that was created. And suddenly he realizes the error of his ways, and he's filled with remorse. And he then turns to Buddhism as the way of guiding. And from that point on, he becomes a very devout Buddhist follower. Of course, one might say, well, what happens to all the bad things that he did previously? Well, that's not really, it's said that even though he's done all these things, when he sort of turned that leaf and becomes a devout Buddhist, now he's doing all these wonderful things for the people, the country, the kingdom, and he's eventually seen to be this great ruler. Some of the things that he did, one was that so when the Buddha passed away, the remains of the Buddha were divided into 8, I guess, portions, and they created stupas, they're mounds basically, grave mounds, if you will, throughout where the Buddha was at. And that tended to be sort of the northeastern part of India. So what Ashoka does is that he actually digs up the 8 burial sites, and he creates, according to the lore, it said he creates 84,000 new sites throughout the empire, and he splits the remains, the relics, if you will. And so scholars have said this 84,000 is probably an exaggeration, but in the Buddha's teachings, it talks about the fact that the Buddha said that there are 84,000 paths to enlightenment. So it might be referencing that. Anyways, he spreads, creates all these different stupas. And there are sites where not only the stupas start off as a site as a relic, place where the relics are kept, but they also become the place where the teachings flourish. And so they end up becoming the foundations of temples, if you will. Okay. And so, in fact, what happens as Buddhism spreads through Asia, you've all heard of pagodas, right? Well, the pagoda actually comes, the origin of the pagoda are these stupas, the burial mounds with relics in them. And so as the Buddhism travels throughout Asia, many of the places no longer have, I mean, you can only split up relics so many ways, right? In fact, there are so many places throughout the world, even to this day, that claim they have a portion of the relics of the Buddha, that I think if you added it up, you probably get about 10 or 20 people, maybe. I'm going off tangent here, but so what happens is that instead of relics, as it goes through Asia, the pagodas become the housing place where they house the teachings. So as the teachings get formalized, okay, the pagodas are sort of the storehouse within the temple. So the treasures of the temple are usually stored in the pagoda, and that will often be like the sutra teachings, etc. So anyways, going back to this, so Ashoka, he does that. He makes all these stupas. He builds all these temples throughout his empire, and he also creates pillars, very large pillars, with a lion on top at various sites that were special to the Buddha. For instance, like Bodh Gaya, where he attained enlightenment, or Lumbini Garden, where he was born. So all these sites that were supposedly very important to the life of the Buddha, Ashoka has these pillars erected with a lion on top. And interestingly enough, that would later become the emblem for the country of India. So that's where that would come from. But what he also does is that he creates Buddhist missionaries. And he sends these Buddhist missionaries throughout his country or kingdom. And so, as I mentioned, this Mauryan kingdom was so vast that one of the places that he sent them is to the west. It's a province called Gandhara, which is now sort of the northeast part of Pakistan. So he sends some missionaries there. And he also sends some missionaries south. And he sends it basically throughout India. And then also they cross the ocean and they end up in Sri Lanka as well. And so he sort of spreads the missionaries throughout. And so the one that goes to this Gandhara region, they end up then going from Gandhara north through the Silk Roads. So there was a trade route that existed that went from basically northwest India, north up through Afghanistan, and then they went east to sort of northern China. Okay, and this is called the Silk Roads, and it was a trade route. And so some of the missionaries that he sent went up that route, okay, the Silk Roads. And that's why the Bamiyan Buddhas are an example of something that came out of that, was going through that Silk Road. And I've mentioned before in other lectures why the Bamyan Buddhas were so big, right? The ones that the Taliban blew up. Why they were so big was that they were beacons on the Silk Road. So just like a hotel would have a billboard, you know, showing that their hotel is there, these large statues would be seen miles away or kilometers away. And they were telling the travelers, you know, this is a place of refuge, a place of rest. So it gave the travelers a place to go to along their routes. So that was the path that went north. Okay. They also went south, as I mentioned, and in Sri Lanka, so there were different schools that formed, and the where is it? When they went south to Sri Lanka, what was that group called? Sorry. Yeah, there was a Sthaviravada group, the more orthodox group. They actually started forming what they call the Theravada Buddhism. Okay, and this is when they have the next Sangha Council. And at that point, so Ashoka ordered another Sangha Council or gathering. And at that time, it was around 240 BC that the third of the Sangha Councils was created or organized through Ashoka's. And at that time, they then gathered what we call the Tripitaka. And Tripitaka means three baskets. Tri, T-R-I is three, and Pitaka means baskets. So what had happened is over the many centuries after the Buddha passed away, the Buddha's teachings was basically orally passed on. So the monks would memorize the teachings. And then the elders would recite the teachings, and the students would then listen and memorize it. But so what happened with the third Sangha Council is at this time, they actually write the teachings, they record it. And what they did was they recorded it on a type of palm leaf and put these leaves into three different baskets. Well, actually, I'm sorry. The second council had the first two of the Pitakas, the Sutta Pitaka and the Sutta Pitaka and the Vinaya Pitaka, they were in existence, but they weren't written down. Okay, so the rules, the precepts, the rules of the order, as well as the words of the Buddha. Sutta means words of the Buddha. Sutra is actually means words of the Buddha. So there was one, as I mentioned, after the first Sangha Council, Ananda recited the words of the Buddha. Okay, that's what we call the sutras. And then Upali recited the Vinaya, the rules of the Sangha. So those two existed orally, but they weren't recorded. So in the third Sangha Council, they actually recorded these onto these palm leaves, and they put it in baskets. And also added to that is what we call the Abhidharma Pitaka. And Abhidharma is an in-depth analysis of the words of the Buddha. So these are basically commentaries by the great monks since the passing of the Buddha. And so all these commentaries were then put into a third basket called the Abhidharma Pitaka. And that formed what we call the Tripitaka, the Pali Tripitaka. And Pali was the language used in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka was a place where they first formalized the written version of the teachings, if you will. Okay, so that from Sri Lanka, they also had Buddhist missionaries. Ashoka had, or even after Ashoka passed away, the missionaries went to Sri Lanka, and then they also went through the Indo-China Ocean. They went east, I guess. And so, you know, they went to places such as Myanmar or Burma at that, or Myanmar now, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia. Okay? And at that time, or after Ashoka passes away, this Mauryan empire crumbles within 40 years after he passed away. However, those movements that he created flourished. So as the Buddhism spread to these Southeast Asian countries, it begins to flourish. And they end up, so during the 7th to 12th century, Malaysia and Indonesia were actually considered one kingdom known as Srivijaya. Okay. And so now, like if you go to Indonesia, it's not a Buddhist country at all. Okay. But at that time, it became a real hub of Buddhism. And in the 9th century, actually the world's largest temple was created, the Borobudur temple. Have any of you seen the Borobudur temple? And that was actually on the island of Java that it was created. A huge complex. And it was created in the 9th century, and scholars from, or I guess monks from throughout the world would gather there for and study. However, as this Srivijaya kingdom declines in the 12th century, and as it declines, so does the Buddhist following. And in fact, in the 13th century, this Borobudur temple is completely abandoned. And it was actually lost. It was, where it was situated was in a very volcanic area. And it is said that over the many centuries, it got covered in volcanic ash. And of course, it was surrounded by nothing but jungles. And so it was overgrown again by the jungle. And it was only found in the 19th century by a British explorer. So that's when it was found that there was a Buddhist temple there. And similarly, in Cambodia, in the 12th century, there was the Angkor Wat temple that was erected by the Khmer people. Originally, this temple was a Hindu temple worshiping Vishnu, but later it was rededicated as a Mahayana Buddhist temple. So at that time, both Hinduism and Buddhism were very popular in the Southeast Asian corridor. Okay, and then also in Cambodia around that time, there were monks from Sri Lanka who arrived and spread the Theravada Buddhism, the way of the elders. And in fact, Cambodia is today predominantly Theravada Buddhist. So over the many centuries that have passed, those Buddhists who went through the Silk Road to northern China, they spread Buddhism throughout China, and the vast majority of those Buddhists became what we call the Mahayana Buddhist school. And the Mahayana Buddhist school was the more liberal of the two schools, where the Theravada Buddhism, they stuck very closely to what we call the Pali Tripitaka, and they followed the precepts, the rules down, very, very, very orthodox. But there was another school that was a little bit more liberal in their understanding, and their goal was the enlightenment of all beings together. So they expanded a little bit, if you will, on the understanding of the teachings. And that became what we call the Mahayana Buddhists. So interestingly enough, we have, so Thailand and Burma or Myanmar, they are very much Theravada Buddhist schools. So the Buddhism came through the Indochina Ocean there and went into those countries, and they became very much Theravada Orthodox schools. But Vietnam, just on the other side of Thailand, is quite unique because not only did they have the Buddhism coming from the south through the ocean, they also had actually a lot of influence of the Chinese coming to Vietnam. And so they have a mixture of both the Theravada and the Mahayana schools. So many of you are probably familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Vietnamese Buddhist, and he actually was exiled from Vietnam because he voiced his opposition to the Vietnamese War, and so he wasn't allowed to go back to Vietnam, and he ended up creating a monastery in France. But Thich Nhat Hanh is what we call Chan or Zen Buddhist, and that is part of the Mahayana school of Buddhism. So Vietnam is a little different from the other Southeast countries. Then the third major lineage of Buddhism that was formed is what we call the Vajrayana, or the diamond teaching. And that Vajrayana is actually what we presently know as Tibetan Buddhism. Okay. And Tibetan Buddhism, again, is very interesting because they had influence both directly from India through Nepal, but they also had influence from Buddhism that came through China. Okay, so they came from both directions. And it wasn't actually for quite a while after the Buddha passed away. It's approximately 1,000 years after the Buddha passed away that Buddhism actually entered Tibet. And there was a Tibetan leader named Songtsen Gampo, and he was, I guess, credited for uniting the Tibetan people, bringing peace amongst the Tibetan people, and known as a great leader of Tibet. And it was said that he was actually very, very much in favor of the Buddhist teachings. And again, this is lore, but the lore says that this Songtsen Gampo married two Buddhist women. One was Chinese and one was Nepalese. And that his wives were very influential in his receiving the Buddhist teachings. And they also expressed that his subjects should learn Buddhism. So Buddhism becomes very popular and prominent in Tibet. And by the 14th and 15th century, Indian masters were regularly going to Tibet, and they established thousands of temples throughout the country. And there are four major lineages of Tibetan Buddhism: the Nyingma, Gakyu, Kagyu, Shaka, and Gelug lineage. And what is interesting about Tibetan Buddhism is that up until actually the 1950s, it was a really little known, almost a fracture of Buddhism. What's unique about Tibetan Buddhism is that Tibet had its own religion prior to Buddhism, called Bon. And when Buddhism entered, they sort of amalgamated to create this very unique type of Buddhism. So a lot of Tibetan Buddhism, we call it Tantric Buddhism. And there's a lot of mysticism also involved with the Tibetan teaching. And so a lot of, the Tibetan Buddhism was really not well known internationally until 1950. And that's when China invaded Tibet to occupy Tibet. And not only did they invade, but they persecuted, they killed a lot of Tibetans. And that's why not only the religious head, but the head of the country, the Dalai Lama, had to end up fleeing Tibet. And of course, he eventually settled in Dharamsala in northwest India, where they created the headquarters, if you will. And so up until then, the Tibet movement was really a minor or not well known internationally. But since then, of course, they've become a major influence in the Buddhist teachings. So getting back to the northern route that Buddhism took, from China, it then went into what we call the Korean Peninsula. And this is around the 4th century. And then in the 6th century, it finally comes into Japan. Now, Japan is very unique in the Buddhist transmission because Japan, as you all know, is an island. So the only way of entering Japan was through the seas. And the regulation of the ships coming in was very highly regulated by the government, the imperial courts. In fact, for a long period of time, Japan was closed off to international trade. So when Buddhism came in, it had to come through the imperial courts. And so the king of Korea sent an entourage with gifts to at that time it was the regent prince, Shotoku. No, it wasn't Shotoku, but it was first introduced in 600 AD, and there were gifts, Buddhist gifts that were given to the Japanese imperial court. And then it was the regent prince, Shotoku, who is really known as the introducer of Buddhism to Japan. And so I'm going to stop here tonight. And next time, what I want to do is talk a little bit about how Buddhism developed in Japan, and then from there, how we ended up coming to North America. And I do apologize that I did this talk without you having the notes in front of you, seeing it, and I will look for those and I will send it out to you as soon as I find them. Again, I apologize for that. It's much better when you can see the maps and you can see these various different temples, and so I feel really bad about that. But and next week I am not going to have a class next week because I'm actually going away to Winnipeg from Friday, and I don't come back till Sunday night, and I just don't have enough time. I got to prepare for the trip to Winnipeg, and I just don't have time to get the notes ready for next week. So there'll be a 1 week break next week. Okay. Are there any questions? I know it's hard when you don't have anything to go by, but does anybody have any questions? Yeah, Atsumi-san, you have a question? You have to unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself. Hey.
確か4つの漢字で、I'm sorry, I'm saying Japanese. I think there is 4 Chinese character expressing Buddhism going from original spot.
Bukkyo Tozen.
Bukkyo Tozen.
Yeah. So the Chinese character Bukkyo Tozen means Buddhism spreads to the east. So from India, it spread east. But in fact, that's not really true because it went to Greece as well. So Greece is west of India. So it did go west as well. But it says there's a natural movement of Buddhism spreading to the east. And so even here, I mean, it came from Japan and China to North America. Is that going west or east? Well, anyways,
That's going east.
Yeah. Are there any other questions or?
It's okay. Good.
Okay, so yeah. Again, I will frantically look for. I hope I find those notes because there's a lot of information in there. I'd hate to have lost them completely, but I will look for them and send them out to you.
Okay, good session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sante.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thanks. Have a good trip.